Good evening. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. Welcome to this evening's episode of Cocktails with a Curator. The Frick Collection is particularly well known for the portraits it has, mostly a collection of European portraits from the 16th all the way to the 19th century by great artists such as Titian, Bronzino, Van Dyck, Gainsborough, Goya, and Whistler. But only two of these portraits are self-portraits. And a self-portrait, of course, is a painting by an artist representing the artist, in this case, himself. And these two self-portraits, by total coincidence, were all painted in the same decade. The one on the left by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, a Spanish painter in Seville, painted probably in the early 1650s, and the one on the right by the Dutch artist Rembrandt, painted in Amsterdam in 1658. It is a coincidence that these two portraits are together at the Frick. But this evening, I would like to focus on the portrait by Murillo, a work that I particularly love at the Frick, and a work that only entered the collection very recently in 2014, even though it was originally acquired by Henry Clay Frick. It was the very first Spanish work Frick acquired in 1904. Murillo chose to represent himself as an elegant man in Seville. You see him here in this black outfit with this typical starched linen collar, known in Spanish as a golilla, and his long flowing hair, his mustache, his goatee make him very much the elegant and wealthy gentleman of Seville in the 17th century. This is probably a portrait that was made for private use for Murillo's own family, and it is one of only two self-portraits that are known by the artist. If you look at this painting, in fact, you would never guess this man is a painter unless you knew that. There is no inclination, no indication that this man was an artist. The inscription at the bottom in red letters in Latin tells us some biographical information. It tells us that this is the true portrait, the true effigy of Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, who was a famous painter who was born in Seville in 1618 and died on the third day of the month of April in 1682. Obviously, this inscription was added after Murillo's death. It's not original to the painting. It was probably added by a later owner, maybe one of the family members of Murillo, who had the portrait. The other self-portrait was painted between 15 and 20 years later, around 1670. And this is now in the National Gallery in London. And here you see Murillo as a slightly older man. He's still wearing a very elegant outfit, but in this case with a soft linen collar. This is probably, it is what is known at that time as a vallona, which is a collar of Northern European origins. And at the bottom, there is, in this case, an original inscription, which tells us that this is Murillo painted by himself, following the desires of his children. And so this is clearly dedicated and probably painted for Murillo's own kids. But in this case, in the London self-portrait, you have a few clues that this is an artist. And if you look at the stone ledge on which the stone frame sits, you find on the right the artist's brushes and pigments, and on the left a red chalk drawing. So there is some indication that Murillo is a painter. This is the self-portrait which in 1682, when Murillo died, was engraved in the north of Europe. And this is one of the prints that was widely circulated in Murillo's lifetime. But the Frick self-portrait instead was the one that appears most often in volumes and books about Murillo. And so here, just to give you a couple of examples, there is a 19th century engraving on the left and a biography of Murillo from 1907, which on the frontispiece has an engraving after the self-portrait at the Frick. We will spend the next this episode in Seville, where the artists spent most of his life. He was born there in not quite 1618, and the inscription on the Frick self-portrait says, but in 1617, he was probably born in the very last days of December 1617 and was baptized in the early days of 1618, hence the confusion. And he spent all of his career up to his death in 1602 in the city. Because of this, I am drinking this evening a typical drink from Seville. It may be the wrong season to drink this. This is a Rebujito, which is usually drunk in Andalusia, in the south of Spain, around the time of the ferias, the feasts in April and May, especially in Seville and in Jerez. This is a sort of gin and tonic. It's made out of manzanilla, and this is fino sherry. And be careful when you order manzanilla in Spain. Of course, manzanilla both means sherry and chamomile tea. You clearly don't want to mix this with chamomile tea. So it's manzanilla and either lemonade, sparkling lemonade, or tonic water and fresh lemon juice with a bit of sugar and some mint. It's a very refreshing drink, perfect for the hot days of the Feria in Seville and Jerez. And I'm wishing I was there right now. Salud. Here you see Seville in the 17th century, the bustling harbor, the great international city. This is actually a city which, as powerful and wealthy as it was in the 16th century, by the time of Murillo's life, was a city very much in economic and social decline for a number of reasons. The harbor was not as active as it was earlier on, and a lot of the maritime routes from Europe to the New World and to other areas, Asia and Africa, were moving very quickly towards other parts of Europe, especially towards England and Holland and Portugal. And so the great power of Seville was very much declining around this time. But it is here that Murillo spends his entire life and career. Unlike his contemporary, Velázquez, who also was born in Seville, but very early on as a young man moves first to Italy and then to Madrid, establishing himself at the court of the King of Spain. And we've seen in another episode how he becomes the official portraitist of King Philip IV. Murillo instead works predominantly for a Sevillian audience. And he becomes very well known for his religious pictures. And this is your typical Murillo, what people usually think of when they think of Murillo. This is one of the great Immaculate Conceptions, life-size, very large paintings in this sort of golden glory of rays of light and angels. He painted many of these subjects. This is the one for Los Venerables, which is one of the religious institutions in Seville, and this is now in the Museo del Prado. These are pictures that were incredibly popular in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and of course only in recent times, partly because of their religious subject matter, partly because of the way in which these scenes are depicted in a rather melodramatic, somewhat saccharine way, have been considered in a lesser way. And I think we still have to look at these works as great works of art in themselves, which of course they are. But Murillo's career was also taken up by other types of commissions. And these are some of the most fascinating paintings by Murillo. He did a whole series of large canvases of underprivileged children in Seville. These are two pictures which I also love very much. They are at Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, where I used to work for a long time, and so I'm very fond of these. They're very mysterious works of art. We don't actually know who commissioned these sort of works to begin with and why. Why did presumably wealthy people around Europe commission works showing unfortunate people who were clearly less well off than them, and especially children? These two, for example, found their way to England very early on during Murillo's own lifetime, and many of these pictures made it to a northern audience in the Netherlands especially. So it seems that these sort of pictures were not actually destined for local Spanish audiences. And they're very interesting as a phenomenon in themselves. Other somewhat strange pictures by Murillo, which have received a lot of attention and different types of interpretations, are pictures like these, genre scenes showing young women and men in Seville, presumably, often coming out of rooms, looking out of windows, with characters that have been interpreted in a number of ways. The one on the left is the young women at a window in the National Gallery in Washington. The one on the right, the group at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth in Texas. Both wonderful pictures. Are these everyday scenes in the streets of Seville that the artist is noticing and recording? Do they have moralistic meaning of some kind, or any allegorical meaning? Or are they simply scenes showing different characters in the lower levels of society in Spain at the time? It's also been argued that both of these paintings may be related in some way or another to prostitution. So obviously, very complicated and complex paintings that we're still trying to understand in their entirety. But Murillo also worked as a portraitist, and this is one of the aspects of his career that hasn't been studied as much as it should. And I've been very interested in this for a while. And Murillo produces a series of very beautiful full-length portraits and some half-length ones. In all, there are about 15 works by Murillo in this genre. And of course, he is working at the same time as Velázquez in Madrid. And of course, I don't want to make a comparison between the two artists at this point, but when it comes to Seville, Murillo is clearly the great portraitist in the city in the 17th century. This is one of the most beautiful full-length portraits by Murillo, I think, not very far away. This is at the Metropolitan Museum, and it shows Andrés de Andrade y Lacal, a notable aristocrat from Seville at the time, with his rather marvelous dog. And these are earlier pictures. The one on the left is the first known portrait by Murillo from 1650, the one on the right from slightly later. These are both in different private collections at the moment. And again, they show notable people in Seville at the time. The man on the left is Juan Arias de Saavedra, and the one on the right is Diego Ortiz de Zúñiga, who was also a historian and wrote a very well-known history of Seville. These are accompanied by these very elaborate cartouches, these sort of fake, fictive stone frames with the coat of arms of the sitters. The Saavedra on the left has a very long inscription at the bottom. The Zúñiga may have had also an inscription, may have been cut down, we're not really sure. And these stone putti that hold these cartouches at the top, at the bottom, and a part very much of these very interesting constructions in terms of portraiture. The Frick self-portrait is also similar in that way, because when you look at it, apart from the image of the artist himself, this is set in a very strange setting. At the bottom, you have a rough stone ledge, and on the stone ledge, a big chunk of stone is placed, which is carved, and within it, there is the portrait of the artist, literally set in stone for posterity. But of course, this, as much as it's meant to be a trompe-l'œil effect, fooling us into a parallel reality through the canvas, it is impossible. I mean, the man cannot physically stand within this rock, this block of stone. The block of stone is also chipped and ruined, and originally, the background, which now looks somewhat brownish, must have looked different. The painting was restored a few years ago at the Metropolitan Museum by Dorothy Mayon, and the scientific department with the Paintings Conservation Department did some analysis on this, and it was discovered that the background was probably originally blue. So this would have been set, most likely, against an open sky outdoors. Why is this? And I find this stone framing particularly fascinating. I spent a lot of time trying to find other examples of similar portraits and similar works, and I have to confess that so far, this really seems to be a unique example of a use of this kind of visual device. But once you start looking at Murillo's work, you realize that stone and ruins appear in many of his works, even in religious ones. So if you look at this beautiful painting of the young Christ as the Good Shepherd, you realize that in the background there is a column, and in the foreground, just behind him, there is a piece of an ancient entablature in stone, in marble. And even when you start looking at the street urchin scenes, you realize that even though they're often described as kids in the streets of Seville, they're actually not in the streets of a busy city. They're in desolate places, outdoors, probably out in the countryside, surrounded yet again by ruins, ruined brick or stone buildings with large outcrops on which vegetation grows. And why is this? We don't really know. What is worth considering is that Seville was the city in Spain that had the most ancient ruins. Unlike Madrid, the capital, which was a city effectively created from scratch in the 16th century and which then grew through the 17th and 18th century, Seville had very ancient origins. It was an ancient Roman city, the city of Hispalis, a very well-known city in the Roman Empire, and many of the ruins of the Roman city survive to this day in the city. So to give you a few examples, here are some of the columns, the beautiful granite columns in one of the streets of Seville, part of an ancient Roman building, which actually stood not far away from one of the houses that was inhabited by Murillo and his family. And on a grander example, this is the courtyard of the Casa de Pilatos, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in Spain, if not in the world, which was the great collection of antiquities of local aristocrats. It then belonged for many generations, still does, to the Medinaceli family. And here you see an monumental marble sculpture that the family had in the courtyard, but also in the background, a bust, an ancient bust in a fictive frame painted or created in stucco, which may be one of the sources behind this idea of encircling some of Murillo's portraits in fictive stone frames. Just a few kilometers away from Seville are the ruins of Italica, one of the largest cities in the ancient Roman Empire. This is the birthplace of the families and two emperors of the ancient Roman Empire. Both Trajan and Hadrian were from Italica. Of course, these ruins were only discovered and scientifically excavated in the 19th century. Murillo wouldn't have known about it, but it's clear that Seville had a large number of antiquities that were excavated in the city and around the city that people collected at the time. And we even have a very interesting glimpse from a document of Murillo himself collecting ancient coins. So clearly, as much as we think of Murillo as the great religious painter, he is also a painter who engaged very directly with antiquity, with the past, and particularly with the past of his own city. Here in the portrait, what Murillo is doing is he's looking precisely at this ancient past through this ruined block of stone, but he's also looking ahead to the future. I mean, clearly this is a portrait intended for posterity, intended for us, for future generations. People hundreds of years after Murillo's death are still looking at him through this portrait. And so clearly this is a very self-aware artist who is setting himself within a broader historical period. The other interesting thing about this portrait is the time when it was painted. This was painted probably in the early 1650s. And between 1648 and 1650, Seville underwent a very traumatic period of 2 years when the plague hit the city. This was one of the most violent epidemics in the history of early modern Spain. A large chunk of the population of Seville died. Many people Murillo knew died of the plague. Fortunately, he was spared. And it has been argued, and this is an interesting way to look at this portrait, that this is almost an ex voto, a painting done in thanks for having survived the plague. So here he is in his mid-30s, a successful, wealthy artist who has just spent a couple of years during this very traumatic period. And of course, the plague in Seville is one of the things that will compromise the economy and the social fabric of Seville effectively for good. This is the beginning of the downfall of the city, and the wealth of it before in the 16th century is never really recuperated, and it's a long period of decline for the city through the 17th and 18th century. Now, the portrait was acquired by Frick in 1904. It had gone through a series of very important collections, including the collections of the King of France. This is a picture that hung at one point at the Louvre in the famous Galerie Espagnole of the King of France. But Frick acquires it in 1904 and hangs it at his beach house at Eagle Rock in Massachusetts, a house which was later, after Frick's death, downscaled and subsequently demolished. Here you see an image of the room in which the Murillo self-portrait was hanging. This meant that when Frick died in 1919, as far as we know, the Murillo had never been displayed at 1 East 70th Street. So, like many things at Eagle Rock, it remained with the Frick family. And so even though this was one of the earliest Old Master paintings bought by Frick and the earliest Spanish one, it didn't joined the Frick collection until very recent times, until 2014. And it was thanks to the generosity of Frick's grandson, Dr. Henry Clay Frick II, and his wife, Mrs. Frick, that the painting came as a gift to the Frick in 2014. And I was very proud and grateful to receive this painting as chief curator when it finally joined the collection only a few years ago. And so now the portrait is part of the permanent collection. Here it is in the house, usually in the south hall between the Vermeers and over the Riesner commode. It will be on view at Frick Madison in the next few months. But also, it was the center of this exhibition between 2017 and 2018. We had an exhibition, Murillo's self-portraits, at the Frick and then at the National Gallery in London. This was the first time that the two self-portraits, first and only time when the two self-portraits were brought together, first in New York and then in London. And what, together with my colleague at the National Gallery in London, Letizia Treves, what we did is we brought all of Murillo's half-length portraits and a series of engravings and books and drawings relating to these self-portraits and other portraits by Murillo together in the same space. So if you would like to know more about the exhibition and about the self-portraits, go on our webpage under the exhibition section, and you will find a series of lectures and links to more information about this painting and about the exhibition. I very much hope that you are enjoying your Rebujito, and I very much look forward to next year, where hopefully in spring and summer, we will be able to celebrate I hope the end of the pandemic, but also the ferias of Seville and of Jerez. See you next week.